Today we'll be working in my workbook called Clearing a Pathway into the Psalms. This is my third workbook on Psalms, and you'll kind of get a visual here in my various titles: opening the curtain, opening the window, clearing a pathway, basically opening up the fog that's around the Psalms. That is, discovering a lot about the Psalms. So, in this book, we'll be working on Psalm 32 through 41. Okay. But since this is the first book of the Psalm, first Psalm in this workbook, we go over this. There is so much to be learned from a study on the Psalms. Sometimes we know what is happening in the author's life when they wrote the Psalm, but most often we can only guess. Psalms are songs of feelings, both of anguish or praise. You can appreciate the Psalm solely for the beauty of the song, but you can also appreciate the Psalms for their literary structure and the historic or knowledge of the time. Let's first start with the title, Psalms. This was not the original name of the songbook. The title Psalms or Psalter comes from the Septuagint, or the pre-Christian Greek translation of the Old Testament. The traditional Hebrew title is Tehillim, meaning praises, although many of the Psalms are actually Tefilloth, or prayers. The Book of Psalms is actually a collection of collections, and in its final stage represents a process that spanned centuries. The collection started during the time of David, as many of the Psalms come from David, who had written many before the collection even started. And the collection started when the temple liturgy was starting to take shape. Its final form was put together by post-exilic temple personnel who finished it around 4 BC. More than just a songbook, the final editor saw it as a book of instruction in faith and in accordance with the law, the prophets, and the writings. It was known as the Book of Psalms by the 1st century AD and is referred this way in Psalm 22. In summary, someone once said if you had one book of the Bible to have it on a deserted island, the Book of Psalms would keep your interest for quite a while. Why is my book called Clearing a Pathway into the Psalms? Because, as with any poetry, there are multiple layers that others might see that I do not. Also, with the translation into English, some of the poetic structure is lost, like an alphabet acrostic of Psalm 25 and 34. So it is a pathway, not a road, and that there is probably more there than I have discovered. Why only Psalms 32 to 41? There are 5 books of the Psalms. The first book is 41 Psalms. My first workbook covered Psalms 121 at 160 pages. My second workbook covered Psalms 22 to 31 at 127 pages. This covers the balance of the first book of Psalms at 149 pages. Separating the Psalms into groups. The Psalm can be divided in many ways. First, 150 Psalms have originally been divided into 5 books, and that's the grouping it you see there, each of which concluded with a doxology. Many relate these divisions to the first 5 books of the Bible. The Psalms can also be divided into classifications. According to Jamieson, Fausset, and Brown, the main types are 1. Didactic or wisdom psalms, which would be similar to Proverbs. 2. Praise psalms. 3. Devotional psalms. 4. Historical psalms. And 5. Prophetical psalms. At times, these classifications overlap. Other classification breakdowns by biblical scholars all seem to center on these, other than adding imprecatory psalms, which I will include as a classification. Imprecatory psalms are those prayers that ask God to seek vengeance on the writer's enemies. Of the 150 Psalms, only 34 lack subheading of any kind. The contents of the subheading fall into several broad categories: author, name of collection, type of psalm, musical notations, sacramental notations, and brief indication of where it was composed. Musical nature of the Psalms. The Psalms are the songs of the Hebrews, even though the score or the sheet music of the Psalms seems to be lost over time. The Psalms include many musical references, such as subscriptions, terms, and phrases. They indicate the type of music or instruments to use. Some titles that may indicate musical direction or musical instruments are, and these are Maskil, which Maskil in the Psalms is a type of psalm, often translated as a contemplative psalm, a meditation, or a psalm of instruction. We have a Kinnor, which is a lyre or harp, and a Nebel Asur, which is a 10-string lyre or harp, both used in Psalm 33. Sometimes just a phrase is given, like for the choir director or chief musician of music or director of music, which indicates that the psalm is to be part of the temple worship or recited by the choir leader. The word Selah shows up a few times. It means either musical pause or literal pause in singing. When I read the Psalms and there's a Selah, I will actually pause, figuring, well, that may be what they're thinking on that. Lastly, before we get to our first psalm, we have talked about the poetic features of the Psalms. There are many poetic features to the Psalms. Hebrew poetry is different than our poetry in that it does not have a rhyme or regular meter, but there are many poetic features that we will identify as we study the Psalms. Please note that I have not identified every instance of these poetic features. These are alphabetic acrostic, using the Hebrew alphabet. Psalm 25 and Psalm 34 use the Hebrew alphabet to start many of the verses. Once the psalm is translated to English, this poetic feature is lost. Antithetical parallelism, contrasting opposing ideas. Inclusio, a literal device where a writer repeats a key word, phrase, or theme at the beginning and at the end of the section of text, creating a framing or bracketing effect that emphasizes the unity and importance of the enclosed text context. Metaphor, a figure of speech that directly compares two unlike things by stating one is the other, or without using the words like or as. Poetic exaggeration, hyperbole, a literary device that uses extreme overstatement, not meant to be taken literally, but to create emphasis, stroke strong emotion, add humor, or make a vivid expression on the reader or listener. Point of view, speaking in first person, me, I, my, or third person, they, them, their. Repetition, repeating the same word or phrase. Simile, the comparison of one thing to another using the words like or as. And synonymous parallelism, saying the same thing two different ways. Okay, with all that spoken, we get to our first psalm. The joy of forgiveness of David, a Maskil. And we'll talk about what Maskil means when we do the comments. Blessed is the one whose transgressions are forgiven, whose sins are covered. Blessed is the one whose sin the Lord does not count against them, and in whose spirit is no deceit. When I kept silent, my bones wasted away, though my groaning all day long. For day and night your hand was heavy on me. My strength was sapped as in the heat of summer. Selah. Then I acknowledged my sin to you and did not cover up my iniquity. I said, I will confess my transgressions to the Lord, and you forgave the guilt of my sin. Selah. Therefore let all the faithful pray to you while you may be found. Surely the rising of the mighty waters will not reach them. You are my hiding place. You will protect me from trouble and surround me with songs of deliverance. Selah. I will instruct you and teach you in the way you should go. I will counsel you with my loving eyes on you. Do not be like the horse or the mule, which have no understanding, but must be controlled by a bit and bridle, or they will not come to you. Many are the woes of the wicked. The Lord's unfailing love surrounds the one who trusts in him. Rejoice in the Lord and be glad. You righteous, sing, all you who are upright in heart. So, with all the Psalms, I do some comments about the Psalms before we move forward. This is just a sampling of a number of authors or commentators about it. This psalm is part of the first book of Psalms, Psalms 1 through 41. The NIV Study Bible states that Psalm 32 is the blessedness of a penitent person. It is part of a group of Psalms 25 to 33 that share common themes of pleas for mercy, professions of trust, and celebration of God's unfailing love. According to Jamieson, Fausset, and Brown, Psalm 32 is both a didactic or wisdom psalm about good and bad men, and also a devotional expressive of penitence. According to J. Vernon McGee, Psalm 32 is a psalm of instruction. Historically, since David doesn't specifically tell us when it was written, Bible scholars can disagree. For Psalm 32, the Blue Letter Bible believes it was written after the pardon of David's adultery in 2 Samuel 12:13. The Nelson Chronological Bible believes it was written after David brought the ark to Jerusalem in 2 Samuel 6. The subheading that was given with this psalm states, of David. In this case, all Bible scholars seem to agree that it is written by David and not about or like David. Although the word that translates as of could mean about and not by, which could mean that someone else wrote it about David or like him in style rather than him writing it, most Bible scholars agree that the psalm appears to be written by David. The subheading also includes a maskil. A maskil in the Psalms is a type of psalm, often translated as a contemplative psalm, meditation, or a psalm of instruction. The term comes from the Hebrew word meaning to understand, to be prudent, to have insight, and indicates a psalm that is literally to impart wisdom, provide instruction on the practical matters of faith. 13 psalms are specifically designated as a maskil in their headings. The term Selah is at the end of verses 4, 5, and 7. It means either a musical pause or a literal pause in singing. Okay? Psalm 32 has two main sections and three subsections for each main section. The main section one is confession is important, verses 1 through 6. This section is divided into blessed are those who confess, verses 1 through 2, what happens when you don't confess, verses 3 and 4, and therefore confess, verses 5 and 6. The second main section is God protects and instructs, verses 7 through 11. This is divided into God protects David, verses 7, God instructs, verses 8 and 9, and ending with therefore be glad, verses 10 and 11. The first main section is confession is important, verses 1 through 6. Let me move this over. First subsection is blessed are those who confess, verses 1 and 2. Verses 1 and 2 have both the poetic structure of a synonymous parallelism, saying the same thing in different ways, and also repetition. There are two separate phrases that are repeated in verse 2 that are in verse 1. What are they? Whose transgressions are forgiven compared to whose sin the Lord does not count against them. And so there's two separate phrases. That repeated. Blessed is the one is repeated. And okay, who sins? Yeah. So sometimes they're short. Verse 2 is synonymic parallel to verse 1 in what way? Blessed is the one whose transgressions are forgiven, come to whose sin the Lord does not count against them. David tells us that the people are blessed who have their sins are forgiven, whose sins are covered, whose their transgressions are forgiven, whose sins are covered, whose sin the Lord does not count against them, and in whose spirit there is no deceit. Paul quotes from these verses in Romans 4, 5 through 8. Romans 4, 5 through 8. To the one who does not work but trusts God, who justifies the ungodly, their faith is credited as righteousness. David says the same thing when he speaks of the blessedness of the one whom God credits righteousness apart from works. Blessed are those whose transgressions are forgiven, whose sins are covered. Blessed is the one whose sin the Lord will never count against them. In the second subsection, what happens when you don't confess, verses 3 through 4. David now confesses to us personally about what it feels like not to confess. What 4 words did David start verse 3 with? When I kept silent. That is, when he did not confess his sins to the Lord. David gives us 3 things that happened when he didn't confess his sins. My bones wasted away through my groaning all day long. The Lord's hand was heavy on him. His strength was sapped as like the heat of the summer. David uses poetic exaggeration, saying something that is not true, but describes a feeling also known as hyperbole. But okay, how did he use it? Okay, so we're talking 3 through 4. His bones wasted away. David uses simile. How does he use it here? My strength was sapped as in the heat of summer, like the heat of summer. Third subsection in the conclusion coming from the first 2 sections. Therefore, confess, verses 5 through 6. First, in verse 5, he is shown what happens when he no longer stays silent, verses 3 and 4, and he confesses to the Lord. We know this because he starts verse 5 with what word? Then. What happened in verse 5 when he confessed his transgressions to the Lord? You forgave the guilt of my sin. Notice both verse 4 and 5 end with the word Selah. Think of it as a pause in music or singing, like giving a moment for the words to sink in. Verse 6 is a response to verses 1 through 2. We know that verse 6 is a result due to the word it starts with. What is this word? Therefore. Like verses 1 and 2, verse 6 is in the third person, whereas verses 3 through 5 were all in the first person. Therefore, let all the faithful pray to you while you may be found. We don't exactly know what David means when he says, while you may be found. But we believe he means that there are definite times when God is near and accessible to us, and times when, because of our sin or hardness of our situation, we are unable or unwilling to come to him. Surely the rising of the mighty waters will not reach them. Is David speaking literally here or figuratively? Bible scholars generally agree that David is talking figuratively. The mention of a rising of the mighty waters is generally understood as a metaphor for overwhelming troubles, calamities, or the consequences of sin, rather than a description of a specific literal flood event in King David's life. I would actually also add, which is not in my notes here, will not reach them, so I don't know if it's on the next page. Anyway, sorry about that. That this also happens in Revelation when the Jews are over in the east and the Antichrist sends an army, a flood, to reach them, and the rising of the mighty waters will not reach them may also apply to that prophetically. Let's see. Okay, so let's move on. Hopefully. Oh yeah, verse verse 6 verse got dropped. I'll have to take care of that in the future. The second main section is God protects and instructs, verses 7 through 11. The first subsection is God protects David, verse 7. In verse 7, David speaks in the first person point of view, directly to the Lord. What does David say the Lord does for him? The Lord is my hiding place. The Lord will protect me from trouble. The Lord will surround me with songs of deliverance. Notice verse 7 ends with the word Selah. Think of it as a pause in music or singing, like the giving a moment for the words to sink in. I think we have a couple Selahs in this psalm. The second subsection is God instructs, verses 8 and 9. Here God is speaking, or through the Spirit, David is speaking for God. In verse 8, God tells us what he's going to do. I will instruct you and teach you in the way you should go. I will counsel you with my loving eye on you. In verse 9, David uses simile to say what God tells us not to do. What animals are we not to be like? Do not be like the horse or the mule. Why are we not to be like the horse and the mule? Because they must be controlled by a bit and bridle. How do you get a horse and mule to do what you want them to do? You have to use the bit and bridle to control them. The final subsection is therefore be glad, verses 10 through 11. The final section is a concluding section. David often concludes or summarizes his thoughts in the ending verses of the Psalms. In verse 10, we have an antithetical parallelism, which is contrasting opposing ideas. What is David contrasting in verse 10? The woes of the wicked versus those who trust him. In verse 11, David uses synonymous parallelism, which is saying the same word or phrase in different ways. What are the synonymous words or phrases to the following? Rejoice, sing, righteous, upright in heart. So what touches you most about the psalm? I will instruct and teach you in the way you should go is what hits me today. How does the psalm live on? Verses 1 and 2 were quoted by Paul in Romans 4, 7 and 8. The Jews use Psalm 32 in their prayer and liturgy, particularly in practices centered on repentance and forgiveness, as it describes the joy of confessing one's sins to God. It is recited on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, and its verses are part of the prayers for the high holidays, including Rosh Hashanah. It is also one of the 10 Psalms in that word collection used for spiritual purification. Songs written from Psalm 32 are Blessed is the Man, Sovereign Love, Hail Sovereign Love, Thou art my hiding place, From depths of woe, Psalm 32, I turn to you, Lord, Undone, and Hiding Place by Don Moen. These are just a few of the songs that are written on this psalm. So that's the end of our deep dive on Psalm 32. I hope you enjoyed it and will continue in our series. Thank you. Bye now.